The sun bled across the western sky, a bruised purple and fiery orange bleeding into a suffocating, dust-choked twilight. Arthur Vance's truck, a faithful, if battered companion, had coughed its last miles ago. Now he was reduced to the monotonous crunch of his own boots on the gravel and the rasp of his breath in the thin, dry air. Hours. It felt like days since he'd taken that goddamn shortcut. The one that was supposed to shave off an hour, but instead plunged him into this godforsaken expanse of scrub and rock. Each mile was a testament to his own stubbornness, a refusal to admit defeat, even when his compass spun uselessly and the GPS had died with a digital whimper hours ago. Despair had begun to settle in, a fine layer of dust clinging to his thoughts, muting the sharp edges of his usual pragmatism. He'd started to accept the inevitability of a cold, lonely night, under a sky that promised more stars than comfort. Then, it appeared. A smudge against the deepening gloom, so faint it could have been a trick of the failing light, a phantom born of exhaustion and thirst. But it persisted, a dark, solid shape against the bruised canvas of the horizon. A structure. His heart, which had been beating a slow, resigned rhythm against his ribs, gave a sudden, hopeful lurch. It was small, barely discernible, but it was there. A silhouette. Not a jagged peak of rock, nor a stunted juniper, but something built, something by human hands. Hope, a sensation Arthur Vance hadn't entertained in a long time, flickered to life. It was a small, fragile flame, easily extinguished by the vastness of his surroundings, but it was enough to change his trajectory. His cynicism, so ingrained it felt like a second skin, warred with the instinct for survival. It was probably just a derelict shed, a collapsed corral, but even that was better than nothing. It was a focal point, an anchor in this sea of nothingness. He adjusted his path, the gravel protesting underfoot as he moved with a renewed, if weary, sense of purpose. The practical part of his brain, the one that always surfaced when things got truly grim, kicked into gear. Shelter. Water, maybe. A chance to assess the damage, to make a plan. He wouldn't admit it, not even to himself, but the sheer, crushing weight of being utterly alone, utterly exposed, had begun to fray his nerves. This silhouette, however insignificant, was a promise of interaction, a potential break in the suffocating isolation. He kept his eyes fixed on the distant shape, willing it to grow, to solidify. The miles seemed to stretch, each one a deliberate test of his resolve. The wind whispered through the sparse brush, carrying with it the unsettling murmur of the wilderness. He imagined it was speaking in tongues, a language of dust and decay, of things that had long since succumbed to the harsh realities of this place. The silhouette remained, a silent, unwavering sentinel, and with each step it grew, resolving itself from a vague suggestion into something more substantial. The initial spark of hope was now a steady ember, a quiet determination to reach it, to see what it held. His body ached, his throat was raw, but his mind was focused on that distant point. He moved with a renewed urgency, the fear of another night exposed to the elements overriding the lingering unease that had begun to creep into his thoughts. He wouldn't let himself dwell on the what-ifs. Not yet. Pragmatism dictated he deal with the reality of what was before him, not the potential terrors that might lie hidden in the shadows. As he drew closer, the details began to sharpen, the silhouette sharpening into definite lines. It was, indeed, a structure, a farmhouse, but not the sturdy, welcoming kind one might find on a tourist map. This was a skeleton. The lines were sharp, angular, but broken, incomplete. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine. Windows, dark and vacant, stared out like the empty sockets of a skull. The wood, what was left of it, was bleached and splintered, weathered to a pale, skeletal gray. It stood alone, stark against the bruised sky, a monument to abandonment. The vast, oppressive emptiness that surrounded it seemed to press in, amplifying its desolation. The silence here was different. It wasn't the quiet of nature settling down for the night. It was a heavy, expectant silence, the kind that felt like a held breath. A prickle of unease crawled up Arthur's spine, a sensation he'd been trying to outrun for weeks. His pragmatism, usually his greatest asset, now felt like a fragile shield against something he couldn't quite define. The farmhouse wasn't just abandoned, it felt emptied, stripped bare, not just of possessions, but of life itself. There was no sign of recent habitation, no tire tracks other than his own tentative ones on the rutted dirt path leading towards it, no smoke curling from a chimney, no sounds of livestock. Just this decaying husk, standing sentinel in the middle of nowhere. The desperate need for shelter warred with a nascent instinct of foreboding. It was a raw, animalistic whisper, urging him to turn back, to face the uncertainty of the open wilderness rather than the palpable wrongness of this place. He slowed his pace, his boots crunching more deliberately on the dry earth. His eyes scanned the perimeter, searching for anything that might offer a clue, a reason for its derelict state. The fence, a brittle network of rusted wire and splintered posts, lay in sections, defeated by time and neglect. The land around the house was parched, cracked, as if it too had given up. A solitary, skeletal tree stood near the porch, its branches clawing at the sky like withered fingers. There was a stillness about the place that felt unnatural, a vacuum where life should have been. He could almost feel the history of the place pressing down on him, a weight of unspoken stories, of hardship and despair. He reached the edge of what was once a yard, now a wilderness of weeds and dry, brittle grass. The porch steps groaned in protest as he approached, each creak a miniature explosion in the unnerving quiet. The front door stood ajar, a dark mouth inviting him in, or perhaps warning him away. It was ajar just enough to suggest it hadn't been sealed shut, yet not open enough to feel deliberately welcoming. It was waiting. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the splintered wood. The pragmatist in him argued. It was shelter. It was a roof. It was a damn sight better than sleeping under the stars with coyotes for company. But the primal instinct, the one that screamed danger, was growing louder. The air here felt different, heavy and still, as if it had been trapped within the house for years, stagnant and suffocating. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, plunging the landscape into deep twilight, and the farmhouse, silhouetted against the last vestiges of light, seemed to loom larger, more imposing, its emptiness radiating a chilling presence. He took a deep, shaky breath, the dry air doing little to calm his racing pulse. The conflict was sharp, visceral, the desperate need for refuge against the undeniable, creeping dread. He could feel the trap closing, the lure of salvation and the whisper of unseen danger locked in a silent, terrifying embrace. The truck's engine coughed its last, a sputtering death rattle that echoed the desolation of the Utah Badlands. Arthur Vance leaned his forehead against the cool, grimy glass of the driver's side window, the vibration fading into a profound silence. He'd been driving for hours, lost, the GPS signal long dead, the sparse, scrubby landscape a monotonous canvas of grays and browns under a sky bleeding into twilight. His pragmatic mind, usually a well-oiled machine of problem-solving, was starting to fray at the edges. Despair was a luxury he couldn't afford, but it was seeping in, cold and clammy. Then he saw it. A smudge against the bruised purple of the horizon, a darker shade of gray, a hint of geometry in the organic chaos. A structure. Hope, A concept Arthur had long since filed away as an inefficient emotion, flickered to life. It was just a silhouette, indistinct, but it was something. A man-made mark on this God-forsaken land. His practical nature, his ingrained habit of seeking solutions kicked in. Shelter. A place to figure things out. He nudged the steering wheel, the truck lurching forward, groaning in protest, crawling towards the faint promise on the horizon. As he drew closer, the silhouette began to resolve. Not a modern building, certainly. Too angular, too squat. It solidified into the unmistakable form of a farmhouse. But the closer he got, the more the initial spark of hope dimmed, replaced by a gnawing unease. This wasn't a beacon of salvation, it was a monument to decay. The farmhouse sagged, its roofline uneven, as if the very structure was tired of standing. The wood was weathered to a silver gray, splintered and cracked like ancient bones. Windows were dark, gaping voids, some boarded up with rough-hewn planks, others shattered, revealing only deeper darkness within. It stood alone, stark and isolated, miles from any other sign of life, a solitary sentinel in an ocean of emptiness. The truck finally gave out completely 100 yards from the property line. A final, wheezing gasp. Arthur killed the ignition, the silence that descended now more oppressive than before. He sat for a moment, the faint, dying light illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cab. The wind whispered through the dry grass, a mournful sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. The farmhouse was a study in abandonment, not the kind that came from economic hardship, from people packing up and moving on. This felt different. This felt abrupt, like a snapshot of a life that had been violently interrupted. He pushed open the truck door, the hinges squealing a protest. The air was dry, thin, carrying the scent of dust, sagebrush, and something else. Something metallic, faintly acrid, like old blood. He stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel path leading towards the house. The vast, oppressive emptiness surrounding it amplified the feeling of foreboding. Every instinct screamed caution, a primal awareness of being deeply, profoundly alone. And yet, not entirely. The porch sagged precariously, a few steps missing entirely. He skirted around them, his gaze fixed on the front door. It was warped, scarred, and firmly shut. He tried the handle. Locked. Of course. He circled the structure, his eyes scanning for any sign of an opening, any weakness in its decaying facade. He passed by a window, its glass so clouded with dirt and grime it was impossible to see through. He noticed peculiar scratch marks on the wooden frame, deep gouges that didn't look like they'd been made by animal claws. They were too deliberate, too angular. Around the back, near what he assumed was the kitchen, he found it. A cellar door, half buried in overgrown weeds, its metal hinges rusted shut. This was his way in. He dug at the weeds with his hands, the dry earth clinging to his fingers. The metal was cold, resisting his efforts. He looked back at the house, at the oppressive stillness. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, and the shadows were deepening, merging. The wind picked up, swirling dust around him, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to whisper just at the edge of hearing. He went back to the truck, rummaging through the meager contents of the passenger seat. A tire iron. Not ideal, but better than nothing. He returned to the cellar door, wedging the tire iron into the gap between the door and its frame. He put his weight into it, grunting with the effort. The rusted metal groaned, a sound like a dying animal. He heaved again, and with a sudden, violent shriek, the hinges gave way. The door scraped open, revealing a black abyss. A blast of cool, stagnant air wafted up, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else. something that made the hairs on his arms prickle. It was the smell of decay, but not just of rot. It was the smell of a place long, long abandoned, a place that had held life, and then lost it. He hesitated, his pragmatic mind warring with a growing, irrational fear. But the thought of spending the night exposed in the wilderness, with nothing but the dead truck for shelter, pushed him forward. He lowered himself into the darkness, the rough-hewn wooden steps creaking ominously under his weight. The air grew colder, heavier as he descended. The only light was the faint glow filtering down from the open cellar door above. He reached the bottom, his boots landing on a dirt floor. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, straining to see anything in the oppressive gloom. The silence here was absolute, broken only by his own ragged breathing. He fumbled in his pocket for his phone, its screen a meager, inadequate flashlight. He swept the beam around. Piles of junk, old canning jars, a forgotten shovel. Then, his light landed on something that made him freeze. A small wooden crate, its lid askew. Inside, nestled amongst brittle, yellowed newspapers, were children's toys. A porcelain doll with one vacant eye, a wooden train set, and a handful of marbles. They looked like they'd been dropped there mid-play. The scene was so incongruous, so starkly out of place, that it sent a shiver down his spine. This wasn't just an abandoned farmhouse. This was a grave. He moved further into the cellar, his flashlight beam dancing across cobweb-laden walls. He was looking for a way up into the house, for any sign of a fuse box or an electrical panel. He found a rough wooden staircase leading upwards. As he ascended, he heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from within the walls. He stopped, straining to listen. It was a rhythmic, insistent noise, like tiny claws scrabbling against wood. Scratch, scratch, scratch. He held his breath. The sound continued for a moment longer, then abruptly stopped, as if whatever was making it had heard him and retreated. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the noise itself. His heart hammered against his ribs. He told himself it was rats, just rats. But the memory of the toys, the abrupt abandonment, the feeling of being watched, it all coalesced into a suffocating wave of dread. He reached the top of the stairs and pushed open another door. This one led into what looked like a pantry, shelves lined with empty jars and rusted cans. He moved through it, into the main part of the house. It was dark, silent, and thick with dust. He found a light switch on the wall, flipped it. Nothing. He tried another, and another. Dead. The house was a husk, devoid of power. He swore under his breath, the frustration a thin veneer over the rising tide of fear. He needed light, and he needed warmth. The wind was picking up outside, whistling through the broken panes with an almost human sound. He made his way through the decaying rooms. A living room, furniture draped in dusty sheets, looking like ghostly figures in the gloom. A dining room, a table set with chipped crockery, as if dinner had been interrupted. A kitchen, pots and pans still hanging from hooks, a film of grime over everything. It was a tableau of sudden departure. He found himself drawn to a small framed photograph on a mantelpiece. A family, a man, a woman, 2 children, smiling faces frozen in time. He felt a strange, hollow ache in his chest. These people were gone, vanished, and he was here, in their silence. He moved through the house, his movements cautious, deliberate. He was a pragmatist, after all. Panicking wouldn't help. He needed to assess the situation. He needed to find a way to get some power. His mind, despite the unsettling atmosphere, began to catalog possibilities. Generator. There had to be a generator somewhere. He recalled seeing something that looked like a utility shed out back, near the cellar entrance. That was his next step. As he reached the hallway, A flicker of movement caught his eye. In the grimy glass of a tall, upright mirror leaning against the wall, he saw it. A reflection, not his own. It was tall, gaunt, and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long, too angular. It was a distorted, shadowy shape, like a silhouette drawn in charcoal. It stood in the doorway behind him, its presence radiating a palpable sense of wrongness. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Nothing. The hallway was empty. He stared at the mirror, his breath catching. Had he imagined it? The dim light, the dust, the stress. It was playing tricks on him. But the image had been so clear, so distinct, yet so utterly alien. He took a tentative step towards the mirror, his gaze fixed on its surface. His own reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed. He held his breath, waiting. The silence of the house pressed in on him, thick and suffocating. Then, from somewhere within the darkened depths of the house, a voice. Soft, hesitant. "Arthur?" He froze. His blood ran cold. It wasn't his voice. It wasn't a voice he recognized. It was a man's voice, but it was flat, uninflected, like a recording played on a faulty speaker. It sounded like it was coming from the floor above. He remained rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to process. His name. Someone had called his name. But how? He was alone. He'd checked. He'd seen the toys, the photographs. There was no one here. "Arthur?" The voice came again, closer this time, from the end of the hallway. A disembodied whisper, chilling him to the bone. It was a sound that clawed at the edges of his sanity, a sound that shouldn't exist. He could feel a primal terror rising within him, a terror that went beyond logic, beyond reason. He was trapped, and something was playing games with him.